So why is this important? Well, this matters because rivalry between Great Britain and France led to a war for control of North America and set the stage for a dispute between the colonists and Great Britain. In the 1700s, Britain and France were the leading European powers. They competed for wealth and empires in different parts of the world. In North America, their rivalry was quite strong. This rivalry turned especially bitter in the mid-1700s. The British began to show interest in the Ohio River Valley. This vast land beyond the Appalachian Mountains was rich in resources. The British believed that they had a right to this land. The French also viewed this valley as theirs. The French enjoyed a thriving fur trade with the Native Americans of the region. They didn't want to share this business with the British settlers. To protect their claim in the valley, the French built a chain of forts from Lake Ontario south to the Ohio River. The British responded by starting to build a fort in what is now western Pennsylvania. Before they could finish, the French seized the site. On it, they built their own fort. They called their fort Fort Duquesne. In the spring of 1754, the governor of Virginia sent a militia, or a military force made up of ordinary citizens, to drive out the French. Leading this force was a young Virginian. His name was George Washington. After marching to Fort Duquesne, Washington set up a small fort of his own nearby. He called it Fort Necessity. Washington's outpost soon came under the attack by the French and their Native American allies. This combined army won the battle and forced Washington's soldiers to surrender. The French later released the soldiers, who returned to Virginia. As the conflict got underway, the French and the British both sought Native American help. The French had a big advantage. They already had many Native American allies. Native Americans generally distrusted the British and their hunger for land. In contrast, the French were more interested in fur trading than in the land. French trappers and fur traders often married Native American women. French missionaries converted many Native Americans to Catholicism. For these reasons, the Native Americans helped the French and raided British settlements. To counter the threat of the French and their Native American friends, the British colonists tried to make a treaty with the Iroquois. The Iroquois Confederacy was the most powerful group of Native Americans in eastern North America. At that time, the Confederacy included 6 nations. Delegates, or representatives from 7 colonies, met with the Iroquois leaders at Albany, New York in June 1754. The Iroquois refused an alliance or partnership with the British. They did, however, promise to remain neutral, which means that they're not going to take a side between the French and the British. The Albany delegates also talked about how the colonists might work together more closely against the French. They decided to adopt Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union for a united colonial government. To form a colonial government, each colony would have to give up some of its power. No one in the assembly was willing to do so. Disappointed, Franklin wrote, "Everybody cries, a union is absolutely necessary, but when it comes to the manner and the form of the union, they are perfectly distracted." The Albany meeting failed to unify the colonists. Meanwhile, the conflict between the British and the French expanded into a full-scale war, the French and Indian War.
Before Europeans arrived on what they would name North American soil, 5 nations came together and formed a confederacy. They were guided by the will of the people, and they created a constitution with 117 articles that guaranteed the rights of the people and the responsibilities of their leaders. That constitution, the great law of peace, still guides those people to this day. So who are they? Well, those Europeans we mentioned would call them Iroquois, but that's not really their name. They are the Haudenosaunee, people of the Long House. We don't know exactly when they formed their confederacy, only that it certainly came before the arrival of the Europeans, perhaps by as much as a millennium. We also know the name of one of its founders, Hiawatha. When Big Huge Games told us that they planned to add Hiawatha as a great leader in their game dominations, we got pretty excited. The Confederacy he formed is an incredible piece of history of governance, one that has survived for centuries and played an acknowledged role in shaping the United States Constitution. And when we asked Big Huge Games if they would be interested in sponsoring 2 episodes about Hiawatha's role forming the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, they got pretty excited. So here we go. But first, a disclaimer. Much of the evidence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's foundation has been handed down through the oral tradition, and where history privileges the written word, a culture that keeps its history through sacred stories will often be left out of the prevailing narrative, or worse, told that they have no history at all. The Haudenosaunee very much have a history, and it's a living history characterized by a variety of perspective and expression. Our goal here isn't to mandate one principal story that must be believed above all others, but to relate one story of Hiawatha as a lens to learn about the living, real, and vital Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Our story begins in Onondaga territory, in a time when people who had once been brothers warred with each other. A chief named Tadodaho led the Onondaga into battle after battle. He was ferocious to the point of viciousness, and although he won many battles, his victories never brought peace, and his lust for violence only grew stronger. The lesser chiefs of his tribe lived in fear of him, and Tadodaho treated them like scum, whose only purpose was to praise and obey him. But one of them did not. His name was Hiawatha. Hiawatha was grieving. His wife had been taken from him by raiders long ago. 2 of his daughters had died of illness that couldn't be cured, and then his 3rd daughter, whom he cherished and tried to protect, died in a tragic accident. Hiawatha found himself looking back on a lifetime of war with regret. This sorrow he felt must surely be shared by everybody who had lost a child or a loved one. War seemed to him like the worst cause of this grief, since unlike illness or misfortune, war could be avoided. At least he believed it could be. He called a council of all the Onondaga chiefs, including Tadodaho, to propose a peace. According to stories he'd heard, their brother tribe, the Mohawk, had embraced a peaceful way of life, and were no longer waging war on anyone. Hiawatha said, if we unite with them, we can protect each other. We'll have no more need of war. Tadodaho hated that idea. War was his identity. It was the foundation of his power. Everyone who looked up to him did so because they feared his strength. He told Hiawatha that if he liked this Mohawk peace so much, maybe he should go live with them. And the remaining chiefs, cowed by Tadodaho, didn't disagree. So Hiawatha left. He traveled to the current home of the Mohawks and sought the man he'd heard stories about, the man who had convinced them to give up their warring ways and embrace peace. His grandmother had given him a different name, but now everybody called him the Peacemaker. Hiawatha waited patiently outside the walls of the Mohawk village where the Peacemaker lived, until the Peacemaker came to him. When they met, Hiawatha gave him a string of shining purple and white beads called wampum. The white ones represented peace, he said, and the dark ones represented war. So he had created a string with white beads on either side of the dark beads to show his desire for peace to overcome war. The Peacemaker had never before seen wampum used to convey a message, and he liked this stranger immediately. The Peacemaker welcomed Hiawatha into his longhouse. When he heard what Hiawatha had proposed among the Onondaga, his face lit up. But as they talked, it became clear that he didn't want just the Onondaga and the Mohawk to be allies. He believed all people could live together in peace, as the Creator intended. Of course, he and Hiawatha agreed that the easiest place to start would be with the 5 nations who already shared similar languages: the Onondaga, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Going back to Tadodaho would be pointless, Hiawatha knew. He would never listen, because he never listened to anything but power. They needed allies. They would need to recruit the other nations first. But how? The other nations didn't know him. They wouldn't listen to him. They needed somebody who could reach out to the chiefs of every nation. They needed someone whom the warriors wouldn't attack on sight. They needed Jigonsase. She had become something of a legend among the warriors. Her longhouse stood at a crossroads, and many warriors sought refuge with her on their marches. She was a Seneca woman, but she allowed anyone to stay in her longhouse as long as they agreed to keep her peace. Often, when warriors of different nations came to her on the same day, she would feed them dinner from the same soup bowl. Tradition dictated that anybody who shared food became kin, and they were forbidden to fight each other. Thus, in her own way, Jigonsase had been forging small alliances across the 5 nations for years. They visited Jagonsase at her longhouse, and the peacemaker explained that he wanted to build one just like it, one that brought together all 5 nations under one great law of peace. Women like her would be the backbone of this new peace, because women were keepers of the earth and leaders of the clans. Clan mothers would be empowered to choose the chiefs, to remove them if they failed in their responsibilities, to call councils, and to review new laws. He asked Jagonsase to be his messenger to the women's councils in all the nations, and to bring his message of righteousness, health, and power. And she replied, "That is indeed a good message. I take hold of it. I embrace it." Together, she and Hiawatha journeyed to the nearby tribe of the Oneida as envoys of the peacemaker's message. The Oneida were the little brothers of the Mohawk, so they were more inclined than anyone else to accept the peace which the Mohawk now embraced. Those who knew Jagonsase trusted her, and welcomed her and Hiawatha among them as speakers who relayed the peacemaker's message. Then the great debate began. The Oneida had suffered plenty from the war, but could they really afford to put aside their weapons and trust peace to protect them? The elders argued that peace had been the way of their people since the land had been given to them. That was the past, though, and now they had many warriors who lived to fight, and enemies who wanted to destroy them. Arguments were levied on both sides, and the discussion raged for a full year. But the peacemaker was insistent. War was an aberration, a betrayal of the wishes of the Creator, and of the interests of the people. If they wanted to be strong, truly strong, they would have to lead the way with their own choices. They must choose peace. They owed it to all of the casualties of war whose bones lay in the ground, whose futures had been cut short. They owed it to themselves to make a new future. They could live without fear if they learned to put hatred aside and unite with a new strength of purpose. Once they embraced peace, others would follow, and they would all gather strength like a ball in the snow. His passion impressed the Oneida, and his arguments won them over. Finally, they agreed. The first treaty of the Great Law of Peace had been formed. Inspired by their success, Hiawatha wanted to return to the Onondaga with this message, and the news that 2 tribes had now embraced it. Tatodaho enjoyed his power, but surely he couldn't stand against 2 tribes united in peace. The peacemaker was willing, but Jagonsase had her doubts. She had heard terrible stories about Tatodaho, his cruelty in war, and his violence toward the women of his own house. "He has an evil heart," she said. "Men like him could never be brought to peace." The peacemaker replied, "It is exactly men like him that I must speak to." So together they journeyed back to the Onondaga, where Hiawatha called together a council. Tatodaho sat across from the peacemaker, and did not listen. Once again he told them that he had no interest in peace, and he wouldn't tolerate any further negotiations. If the Mohawk and the Oneida wanted to embrace this great law of peace, fine for them. That just meant they would leave him alone so he had fewer enemies to defeat, and he had every intention of continuing to make war on his enemies. Hiawatha left this council in low spirits, but the peacemaker's hopes remained bright. He told Hiawatha to keep thinking about how to bring Tatodaho around to the idea of peace, and in the meantime, the 3 of them would set out for the lands of the next tribe on their list, the Cayuga. Just as the Oneida were the little brothers of the Mohawk, the Cayuga were the little brothers of the Onondaga. They had suffered greatly from Tatodaho, who treated them poorly but demanded that they fight in his wars. They could never refuse for fear that Tatodaho would turn his much larger force against them. To them, an alliance with the Mohawk and the Oneida sounded like the perfect way forward. The chiefs readily agreed and joined the Great Law of Peace. Now they had taken an ally from under Tatodaho's control. They had diminished him. Perhaps they could remove him from power entirely, but that wasn't what the peacemaker wanted. He needed the people to unite, to choose peace, and to come together like a family. In a family, no one was beyond saving. Luckily, Hiawatha now had a plan. Join us next week as the peacemaker and his speakers return to confront Tatodaho and bring the last of the 5 nations together under the Great Law of Peace.
The French enjoyed early success in the war. They captured several British forts. Meanwhile, their Native American allies carried out raids on the frontier or the edges of the colonies. They killed colonists, burned farmhouses and crops, and drove many families back towards the coast. Their turning point came in 1757 when William Pitt became Prime Minister, or the head of the British government. Pitt was a great military planner. He sent more trained British troops to fight in North America. To stop colonial complaints about the cost of the war, Pitt decided that Britain would pay for it. He knew that after the war, the British would raise the colonies' taxes to help pay the larger bill. Pitt had only delayed the time when the colonists would have to pay their share of the military cost. His goal was not just to open the Ohio River Valley. He also wanted to conquer French Canada. In 1758, British forces won a key victory at Fort Louisbourg in present-day Nova Scotia. The same year, a British force made up mostly of New York and New England militia captured Fort Florence at Lake Ontario. Another British force finally took Fort Duquesne. The British renamed it Fort Pitt. Quebec, the capital of New France, sat on a cliff above the St. Lawrence River. Because of its position, Quebec was thought to be impossible to attack. In September 1759, British scouts spotted a poorly guarded path along the back of the cliff. At night, Wolfe's soldiers overwhelmed the French guards and scrambled up the path. The British troops then surprised and defeated the French army on a field called the Plains of Abraham. The fall of Quebec and Montreal the next year marked the defeat of France in North America. The war in Europe finally ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This treaty forced France to give Canada and most of its lands east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. Great Britain also received Florida from the French ally Spain. Spain acquired French lands west of the Mississippi River called Louisiana, as well as the port of New Orleans. The Treaty of Paris marked the end of France as a power in North America. In its aftermath, North America was in the hands of two European powers, Great Britain and Spain.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War, the Prussians called it the Third Silesian War, Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years. So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class, me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one thing as making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception. which means it's time for a Mongoltage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory of all came in September when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida from Spain. In return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about the author of the mystery document, I will be shocked by electricity. If I am right, I will be shocked by my knowledge of 18th century primary sources. Okay, here we go. We humbly conceive that it is contrary to the maxims of good policy and extremely dangerous to our frontiers to suffer any Indians of what tribe soever to live within the inhabited parts of this province while we are engaged in an Indian war, as experience has taught us that they are all perfidious, and their claim to freedom and independence puts it in their power to act as spies, to entertain and give intelligence to our enemies, and to furnish them with provisions and warlike stores. To this fatal intercourse between our pretended friends and open enemies, we must ascribe the greatest of the ravages and murders that have been committed in the course of this and the last Indian War. We therefore pray that this grievance be taken under consideration and remedied. Enough. Usually you either know it or you don't. And I don't. The author is clearly not an Indian. The first person plural makes me think the author is probably not an individual, which makes it harder. Certainly we're getting a taste of the tension between colonists and Native Americans on the frontier. But who is writing about this tension? I have absolutely no idea. Stan, you get to shock me. Who is it? Are you serious? I told you it has to be an individual person! Fine. Ah! So after the end of the 7 Years' War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. So the settlers duly ignored the proclamation line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism initially meant supporting a government without a king, but in the colonies colonies, it came to mean something broader. Now, they didn't believe that everyone was equal. Republicans believed that only property-owning citizens possessed virtue, which was defined in the 18th century not as being like morally good, but as a willingness to subordinate one's personal interest to the public good. This type of republicanism harkened back to a Roman ideal, only, without Caesar stabbing and togas. Stan, I wish you wouldn't. And a second type of political philosophy grew out of ideas that in the 18th century were called liberalism. For classical liberals, the main task of government was to protect citizens' natural rights, which were defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. For liberals like Locke, governments were the result of a social contract whereby individuals would give up some of their liberty in exchange for a government protecting their natural rights. So republicanism and liberalism were undermining traditional political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists, so my! Even the old-line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional in the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739 to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching.
The French defeat was a blow to the Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. They had lost their French allies and trading partners and now had to deal with the British. The British raised the prices of their goods. Unlike the French, the British refused to pay Native Americans to use their land. Worst of all, more colonists began settling in Native American lands. Many Native Americans saw the settlers as a threat to their way of life. One of these was Pontiac, the chief of the Ottawan village near Detroit. In 1763, Pontiac and his forces captured the British fort at Detroit and other British outposts. During Pontiac's war, Native Americans killed settlers along the Pennsylvania and Virginia frontiers. The same year as Pontiac's war, Britain's King George declared that the colonists were not to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. To enforce this new rule, the British planned to keep 10,000 troops in America. The Proclamation of 1763 helped to remove a source of conflict with the Native Americans, and it also kept the colonists on the coast, where the British could control them. The colonists, however, believed that the proclamation limited their freedom of movement. They feared that the large number of British troops might interfere with their liberties. As a result, distrust began to grow between Britain and its American colonies. Britain's financial problems also led to trouble. Deeply in debt as a result of the War of France, the British government made plans to tax the colonies and tighten trade rules. These efforts would lead to conflict and eventually revolution. Alright, so let's go ahead and review this lesson. Make sure you understand these vocabulary terms and the key ideas from this lesson. If you're confused about something or you don't know something, go back over, rewatch the video, read your textbook, or ask your teacher for help.